The orders arrived not with the blare of a trumpet, but with a whisper of paper, a single coded message that felt heavier than any weapon Jean had ever carried. It was passed to him in the damp cellar of a ruined farmhouse on the outskirts of a nameless French village, the air thick with the scent of cold earth and desperate hope. The flickering lamplight cast long dancing shadows that seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. Jean's face, a roadmap of hard-won survival, remained impassive as he read, but his knuckles whitened around the paper's edge. The war, which had already carved so much from the world, was now asking for something more. It was no longer a fight for territory, but a plunge into the dark, a mission born from whispers of Nazi obsession with things best left buried. He gathered his unit in the cramped space, their faces a study in the varied hues of resistance. Pierre, the scholar-turned-soldier, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his intellectual curiosity already piqued by the cryptic nature of the summons. His mind, accustomed to parsing ancient texts, saw the mission not just as a military objective, but as a historical puzzle box waiting to be unlocked. Across from him, Henri leaned against a crumbling stone wall, a smirk playing on his lips. For him, every mission was a stage, another chance to prove his mettle and regale his comrades with tales of his own exaggerated bravery later. He cracked a quiet joke about the mountain air being good for the complexion, a feeble attempt to slice through the tension that clung to them all like a shroud. Jean's voice, when it came, was low and steady, a rock in the swirling uncertainty. He laid out the objective, with a soldier's precision, a high-altitude infiltration into the heart of the Alps, a Nazi tunnel complex carved deep within the granite flesh of the mountains. The official reason was the recovery of stolen artifacts, priceless cultural treasures looted from across Europe. But the subtext, the unspoken dread that hung in the air between the lines of the orders, spoke of something else entirely. Allied intelligence hinted at research that strayed far from conventional warfare, delving into realms of the occult and the esoteric. Pierre's eyes gleamed with a dangerous fascination as Jean described the symbols mentioned in the briefing, markings that predated any known civilization. Henri, however, shifted his weight, his bravado momentarily faltering. He was a man of action, of clear targets and tangible enemies. This talk of ancient symbols and hidden knowledge sat uneasily with him, a phantom opponent he couldn't shoot. Jean watched them both, feeling the weight of his leadership more acutely than ever. This was not a simple raid. It was a step into the unknown, a test of duty against the primal fear of what might be waiting in the dark, silent places of the world. They were being asked to walk into a shadow, and Jean's steadfast heart questioned not if they would go, but what they would find when they arrived. The ascent into the Alps was a trial by ice and stone, a brutal reminder that nature held no allegiance in the war of men. Each step was a battle, the thin, biting air searing their lungs as they climbed higher, leaving the familiar world of forests and fields far below. The jagged peaks clawed at a sky the color of lead, and the wind howled through the passes with a voice that seemed to speak of ancient, indifferent things. They moved like ghosts against the vast white canvas, their dark figures small and insignificant against the immense crushing scale of the mountains. Every shadowed crevasse and overhanging cornice was a potential tomb, and the ever-present threat of German patrols turned the majestic landscape into a deadly chessboard. Jean led from the front, his movements economical and sure, his eyes constantly scanning the treacherous terrain for both natural hazards and the telltale signs of the enemy. His leadership was a quiet, steady force, a compass needle holding true amidst the disorienting whiteness. Behind him, the bonds of the unit were forged anew in the crucible of the climb. Henri, true to his nature, became the group's defiant heart. Between labored breaths, he muttered a stream of wry observations and gallows humor, his jokes about frostbitten toes and the culinary merits of snow, a fragile but vital shield against the pervasive dread. His laughter, though strained, was a spark of warmth in the freezing void, a stubborn declaration of their shared humanity. It was during a brief, harrowing rest huddled beneath a rocky outcrop that Pierre found his voice, the intellectual curiosity that had burned so brightly in the cellar, now tempered by the raw, physical reality of their mission. Huddled close for warmth, his glasses fogged with his own breath, he confessed his fears to Jean not in a whisper of cowardice, but in a tone of profound unease. He spoke of the historical precedents, of cultures that had sealed away knowledge for a reason, of the arrogance in believing they could simply walk into a place built on such foundations and walk back out unchanged. He wasn't afraid of the Nazis, he explained, but of what the Nazis had been afraid of, what had driven them to dig so deep and hide so well. His words hung in the frozen air, a stark contrast to Henri's jests, painting the mission not as a noble retrieval but as a potential trespass. Jean listened, his gaze fixed on the distant, cloud-shrouded peak that was their destination. He offered no platitudes, only a firm grip on Pierre's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden. This was the brotherhood of adversity, a tapestry woven from Henri's defiant humor and Pierre's fearful intellect, all held together by Jean's unyielding resolve. They were a chain of disparate links, and the mountains were testing every one. As they pushed onward, the wind seemed to carry more than just the cold. It carried the faint, echoing memory of the whispers from their briefing, a siren song pulling them deeper into the silent, waiting heart of the range. The mountain did not want to give up its secret. They stood at the coordinates, a sheer wall of granite and ancient ice that seemed to mock their mission. According to the maps and the frantic, half-believed reports from Allied intelligence, the entrance to the Nazi complex was here, a gash in the stone hidden from the sky and from prying eyes. But there was nothing, only the wind, a low, mournful sigh that coiled around the peaks, and a silence so profound it felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence. It was a thick, heavy quiet that pressed against their eardrums, swallowing the crunch of their boots on the scree and the ragged rhythm of their breathing. Pierre was the first to move, his scholar's mind overriding the soldier's instinct to remain still. He ran a gloved hand over the rock face, his fingers tracing seams and fissures invisible to the others. He muttered to himself, a soft stream of geological and architectural theory, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He pointed out the subtle, unnatural straightness of a crack, the way the ice seemed to have formed in a layered, almost deliberate pattern. Henri, ever impatient, scoffed quietly and hefted his pack, his eyes scanning for a more conventional door, a guard post, anything that made sense. But Jean felt it too, the wrongness of the place. It was more than camouflage, it was an integration, as if the mountain itself had been persuaded to hide what lay within. Working together, they applied their skills like surgeons to the stone. Henri, with his brute strength, carefully levered at a section of rock Pierre had identified, while Jean and the others used picks and knives to chip away at the layered ice. It was slow, meticulous work, and with every fragment that fell away, the silence seemed to deepen, becoming a tangible weight on their shoulders. The air grew colder, a deep, marrow-chilling cold that had nothing to do with the altitude. It was the cold of a tomb, of a place that had been sealed away from the sun for a very long time. Then, with a final, grating shift of stone, a section of the rock face swung inward, revealing a darkness so absolute it seemed to drink the weak alpine light. A wave of stale, frigid air washed over them, carrying with it a scent of damp rock, of ozone, and something else, something metallic and ancient, like old blood and rusted iron. The entrance was a black maw, roughly hewn but unmistakably artificial, leading down into the bowels of the mountain. Jean took a step forward, peering into the impenetrable gloom. And as he stood on the threshold, a profound sense of foreboding settled over him, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a primal warning, a vibration in the very core of his being. He felt a presence, not in the tunnel ahead, but in the air around them, in the unnatural silence, in the way the shadows at the edge of the entrance seemed to cling a little too tightly to the rock. It was as if they had not simply found a hidden door, but had torn a veil, a fragile barrier between the world they knew and another, older, and infinitely more terrifying one. The mountain had been a guardian, and they had just broken its seal. The darkness inside the mountain was not merely an absence of light, but a physical substance, thick and cloying, that swallowed the beams of their torches after only a few feet. The air was a stagnant cocktail of chilled stone, machine oil, and the faint, sweetish odor of decay. Their footsteps, tentative on the rough-hewn floor, echoed with a hollow, lonely sound that traveled down the tunnel ahead of them, as if announcing their intrusion to the deep, silent heart of the complex. They moved in a tight, nervous formation, the world outside reduced to a sliver of gray light at their backs. A memory of a reality that was rapidly receding. The tunnel soon opened into a larger chamber, and their torch beams swept across a scene frozen in frantic abandonment. It was a command post, a relic of the Reich preserved in the mountain's cold embrace. Desks were littered with papers, field telephones sat silent, their cords coiled like dead snakes, and a large radio console, its vacuum tubes dark, dominated one wall. But it was the other details that seized their attention, that twisted the familiar horror of war into something far more unsettling. Swastika banners hung limply from the stone, the red and black stark in the artificial light, but they were flanked by other symbols painted directly onto the rock in a dark, tar-like pigment. These were not Nazi iconography. They were jagged, spiraling patterns, concentric circles bisected by sharp angles, and shapes that suggested forms both alien and organic. They seemed to pulse with a faint, latent energy in the dancing light, a visual whisper that set teeth on edge. Pierre moved as if in a trance, drawn to a heavy, leather-bound journal left open on a commander's desk. The others fanned out, their weapons held ready, searching the shadows for a threat that was no longer corporeal. Henri kicked over an empty ammunition crate, the sound unnaturally loud, his bravado stripped away by the oppressive atmosphere. He stared at the strange symbols, his face a mask of confused revulsion. This was not the clean, ideological enemy he understood. This was a madness he could not comprehend. Meanwhile, Pierre had begun to read the journal, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the spidery, frantic script. The entries were not military logs. They were the ravings of an obsessed mind, a high-ranking SS officer named Vogel. The early pages detailed a fanatical belief in finding a source of ultimate power, a weapon to end the war, and usher in a 1,000-year reign. But as Pierre turned the pages, the tone shifted. The obsession curdled into something else. Fear. Vogel wrote of hearing voices in the rock, of seeing shadows move where no light source existed. He detailed experiments, attempts to commune with the intelligence he believed was imprisoned within the mountain, transcribing the very symbols that now adorned the walls. The final entry was a single scrawled sentence, the ink blotted as if by a shaking hand. We did not discover it. It allowed us to find it. The gate must not be opened. Pierre looked up from the page, his face pale, the horror of forbidden knowledge dawning in his eyes. They were not in a military base. They were standing in the outer sanctum of a temple to an unimaginable god, and the high priests had fled in terror from their own congregation. Beyond the abandoned command post, the tunnel widened into a cavern so vast their torch beams could not find the ceiling. The air grew colder, carrying a dry mineral scent that spoke of immense age. The walls here were not merely marked with the occasional symbol, they were a canvas of insanity, a sprawling tapestry of glyphs and sigils carved deep into the living rock. These were not the hasty tar-painted markings of the Nazis. These were something else entirely, etched with a patient, terrifying precision, their lines so smooth and deep, they seemed to have been made by something other than human hands. The sheer scale of the artwork was humbling, a visual roar in the crushing silence. Pierre approached the nearest wall, his breath catching. He ran his fingers over a complex spiral that seemed to twist in on itself infinitely. His scholarly mind, usually so methodical, raced to find a reference point, a cultural touchstone. He recognized nothing, not from the Egyptians, the Sumerians, or any lost civilization he had ever studied. The patterns were geometric yet fluid, mathematical yet alive, depicting forms that were both celestial and visceral. Some resembled star charts of unknown constellations, while others evoked the intricate, unsettling symmetry of a spider's web, or the internal structure of a bone. This was a language, he was certain, but one born before man had learned to speak, a testament to an intelligence that was ancient when the mountains were still young. A quiet, tense debate sparked among the men. One of the younger fighters, Claude, insisted they were just more Nazi madness, an elaborate hoax to unnerve intruders, but his voice lacked conviction, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the chamber. Pierre argued back, his own voice trembling with a mixture of terror and awe. He pointed out the erosion on the carvings, the way the stone itself had begun to weather the deepest grooves. This was no wartime construction. This was older than any cathedral, any pyramid. It was a relic from a time before time, and the Nazis had merely been the latest fools to stumble upon it. The confrontation was not between two men, but between two worldviews, one clinging to the rational, the other forced to acknowledge a reality far stranger and more dangerous than any war. While the others argued in hushed, strained tones, Henri, feeling useless and unnerved, wandered toward a collapsed stone altar at the chamber's center, kicking at the rubble. His boot dislodged a small metal strongbox, its Nazi insignia stark and incongruous against the primordial backdrop. He pried it open with his knife. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were not jewels or gold, but a sheaf of notes, written in the same frantic hand as the journal Pierre had found. These were more personal, more desperate. They were the transcribed ravings of a man named Dr. Richter, Vogel's chief researcher. They spoke of the old ones, of the geometry of sleep, and of a key hidden within the symbols themselves. The final note was a single, cryptic line, underlined twice. The gate does not open out, it opens in. Henri stared at the words, the paper feeling like ice in his hand. His bravado, which had always been his shield, shattered completely. This was not about stolen art or secret weapons. This was about something that made the war, the Nazis, even the mountains themselves, seem like fleeting, trivial things. He looked from the ancient, unknowable symbols on the walls to the modern, terrified scrawl in his hand, and the tension in the chamber snapped taut. They were not just trespassers in an enemy base. They were flies that had wandered into a web woven at the dawn of the world, and the spider, an ancient evil of impossible scale, was beginning to stir from its slumber, its timeless malevolity confronting the fragile modernity of their very souls. The chamber's oppressive grandeur narrowed their focus to its very heart, where the floor fell away into a sight that defied all reason. It was not a void, but an entity, a fissure of pure, lightless black that seemed less a part of the rock and more a tear in the fabric of reality itself. Roughly 10 feet across, its edges were not jagged stone, but appeared blurred, as if viewed through heat haze, though the air around it was deathly cold. From its depths came a dry, radiating heat that carried no comfort, only a sense of profound desiccation, as if it were leaching the very moisture from their skin. And with the heat came the whispers. Not a sound heard with the ears, but a vibration felt in the marrow, a susurrus of ancient, incomprehensible thoughts that coiled through the mind like smoke, offering nothing and promising everything. The men stood frozen, a line of ragged humanity on the precipice of the impossible. The torches in their hands seemed feeble, their light unable to penetrate the absolute darkness of the fissure, which instead seemed to pulsate with a slow, rhythmic cadence, a black heart beating at the center of the mountain. It was a hypnotic sight, a vortex of nothingness that exerted a tangible gravitational pull on the soul. Two of the younger fighters, their eyes glazed and faces slack, took an involuntary step forward, their weapons hanging forgotten at their sides. The whispers were louder for them, a seductive call that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to some deep, buried instinct. It was a call to come closer, to surrender, to become part of the silent, ancient dark. Jean's voice cut through the trance, a crack of command that was sharp with a fear he could not entirely conceal. He barked an order to hold fast, to fall back, his own body tensed as if physically resisting the fissure's draw. His mind, a fortress of duty and pragmatism, recoiled from the thing before them. This was no weapon, no artifact. It was a predator, and its bait was the weakness within each of them. He saw the temptation playing out on the faces of his men, the lure of oblivion for the weary, the promise of answers for the curious, the siren song of an end to the struggle. The peril was not in a gunshot or a trap, but in the slow, insidious unraveling of their will. A growing unease, thick and cloying as tar, filled the chamber. The ancient symbols on the walls seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight, their silent language now feeling like a warning they had been too arrogant to heed. The heat from the fissure intensified, carrying with it the psychic scent of ages, of stars dying and civilizations turning to dust. The whispers coiled tighter, no longer an ambient noise but a targeted assault, probing for fears, for regrets, for the cracks in their resolve. They stood on the threshold of a choice far greater than any battlefield decision, a test of spirit against a darkness that offered the ultimate temptation, to simply stop fighting and be consumed. The whispers were no longer a distant vibration in the stone but had become a personal, intimate assault. They slithered from the fissure's black heart, threading through the cold air to coil around each man like a spectral serpent. They were not words in any known language, yet their meaning was horrifyingly clear. Jean heard his daughter's name, spoken in her own voice, a ghostly echo from a life he feared he would never see again. Henri flinched, his head snapping to the side, as if someone had just called to him from the shadows, the sound a mocking imitation of a fallen comrade. Each man was targeted, the whispers plucking at the strings of their most private memories and deepest fears, a tailored symphony of psychological torture. The chamber was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of their own damnation, a chorus of ghosts only they could hear. As the whispers intensified, so too did the behavior of the shadows. The torchlight, once a tool of illumination, had become a source of terror. The shadows it cast no longer obeyed the laws of physics. They stretched and contracted with a life of their own, pooling in corners with an unnatural density. From the periphery of their vision, the men saw the darkness shift, forming fleeting humanoid silhouettes that detached from the walls and skittered just out of sight. When they turned their heads, the shapes were gone, leaving only the cold, carved stone. It was a dance of madness, a visual echo of the auditory torment. The very air seemed to thicken with paranoia, every flicker of light a potential threat, every patch of darkness a hiding place for something that should not exist. In the midst of this escalating horror, Pierre stood transfixed before the wall of ancient symbols. His face, pale and slick with a cold sweat, was illuminated by a frantic, feverish light. He was no longer just examining the carvings, he was communing with them. His lips moved silently, his fingers tracing the spirals and angles with a trembling reverence. He suddenly turned to Jean, his eyes wide and unfocused, his voice a dry rasp. He claimed the symbols were not just a language, but a syntax, a grammar of creation and unmaking. He said he could understand it, that the patterns were aligning in his mind, revealing truths that were shattering his sanity. He spoke of the fissure not as a gate, but as a mouth, and the whispers as its breath. He was not translating words, he was interpreting the intent of an ancient cosmic hunger, and the knowledge was carving hollows in his soul, a clear and terrifying descent into a madness born of forbidden comprehension. The stone itself betrayed them. One moment, they were standing in the vast symbol-carved chamber, the pulsating black fissure a fixed point of horror at its center. The next, the very ground beneath their feet groaned with a sound of tectonic agony, a deep grinding shudder that vibrated up through their boots and into their bones. The air filled with a fine, choking dust as the walls began to move. It was not a collapse, not a random cave-in. This was something far more deliberate, far more intelligent. A section of the wall to their left, covered in spiraling glyphs, slid across the floor with the smooth, silent grace of a closing iris, sealing off the tunnel they had entered from. From the right, a new corridor materialized, its opening a raw, dark wound in the rock that had not been there seconds before. The labyrinth was not a static maze, it was a living, breathing entity, and it had just awoken to their presence. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the group. The two youngest fighters, already frayed by the whispers and the shifting shadows, broke. One of them, a boy named Luke, let out a strangled cry and bolted for the newly formed opening, desperate for any escape from the chamber and its terrible heart. He vanished into the darkness, his footsteps echoing for a moment before being abruptly cut off. The rest of the men recoiled, their torches sweeping wildly across the shifting architecture, their world dissolving into a nightmare of impossible geometry. Henri slammed his fist against a newly formed wall, the solid impact doing nothing but sending a jolt of pain up his arm, a futile protest against the unraveling of reality itself. Jean's voice rose above the chaos, a beacon of strained authority in the disintegrating dark. He bellowed orders for everyone to hold their position, to stay together, his own heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He grabbed Pierre by the shoulder, shaking him from his trance-like fixation on the symbols. The intellectual's face was a mask of terrified awe, as if he were witnessing a divine and terrible miracle. But Jean needed a soldier now, not a scholar. He shoved Pierre toward the center of their shrinking group, forming a defensive huddle with the remaining men, their torch beams crisscrossed, illuminating the impossible ballet of stone around them. A pillar of rock erupted from the floor, forcing them to stumble back toward the fissure, its dry heat now feeling like the breath of a hungry beast. The brief separation caused by Luke's flight had fractured their unity. Eyes darted nervously, not just at the moving walls, but at each other. Trust, that most vital commodity in the darkness, was beginning to crack. The whispers from the fissure seemed to feed on the rising terror, their insidious promises now laced with taunts, suggesting that the labyrinth was merely a reflection of their own crumbling minds. Jean struggled to maintain order, his commands becoming more desperate, his own fear a cold knot in his stomach. He was a leader of men, trained for ambushes and firefights, not for a battle against the very fabric of the world. The walls closed in, then shifted apart, corridors snaking into existence only to be sealed moments later. They were no longer explorers in a complex, they were specimens in a cage, and the keeper was the mountain itself, its ancient malevolent intelligence, now fully roused and toying with its new prey. Reality was not just bending, it was breaking, and they were falling through the cracks. Desperation bred futile rituals. With the labyrinth shifting around them in a constant groaning dance, the men scrambled for any semblance of control. Henri, his pragmatism screaming against the impossible, took his combat knife and began scoring deep, angry marks into the stone walls at each new junction, a trail of breadcrumbs in a forest of living rock. Another fighter, Claude, used a stub of chalk from his pack, drawing frantic arrows on the floor, pointing the way back to the last known chamber. For a few precious minutes, it seemed to work. The marks remained, a testament to human order imposed on supernatural chaos. They followed Henri's gashes around a corner, only to find the corridor ending in a solid, unmarked wall of granite. Retracing their steps, they discovered Claude's chalk arrows now pointed in 3 different, impossible directions, the lines themselves smeared and distorted, as if the stone had sweated. The labyrinth was not just moving, it was mocking them, erasing their efforts with contemptuous ease. A profound helplessness began to seep into their bones, colder than the mountain's chill. They found themselves back at the same T-junction for the 3rd time, the distinctive spiraling symbol on the central pillar now a familiar taunt. The corridors were looping endlessly, a Mobius strip of stone designed to grind down their hope. The whispers, which had never fully ceased, now took on a new, jeering quality, echoing their own panic thoughts back at them in twisted mimicry. The men's breathing grew ragged, their movements becoming sluggish with a despair that was as tangible as the walls themselves. They were rats in a cosmic maze, and the scientist was not merely observing, but actively rearranging the walls for its own amusement. It was Pierre who finally gave voice to the terrifying truth, his theory emerging not as a triumphant discovery but as a sentence. Huddled in a dead-end alcove as the walls outside slid and grated, he stared at the symbols glowing faintly in the torchlight, his eyes wide with horrified understanding. He explained, his voice a hollow monotone, that the symbols were not mere decoration. Forgotten language. They were commands. They were the labyrinth's operating system, etched into the very substance of the mountain. Each glyph represented a potential configuration of space, a set of instructions that the living stone was obeying. The Nazis hadn't built the maze, they had merely been the latest to stumble upon its control panel and, in their arrogance, had likely activated something they could never hope to contain. The labyrinth was awake, and it was reading the ancient code written on its own walls, shifting its geometry to a purpose as inscrutable as the symbols themselves. His words did not bring clarity, only a deeper, more profound despair. They were not just trapped, they were inside the mind of a sleeping god that was now dreaming, and they were utterly, hopelessly subject to its whims. Exhaustion was the 3rd enemy, a silent predator that had been stalking them since the first unnatural shift of stone. It was not the clean weariness of a long march, but a soul-deep fatigue that seeped into their minds, eroding reason and sharpening every fear into a weapon. The air, still thick with the dry heat of the fissure and the psychic residue of the whispers, felt heavy to breathe, each lungful a conscious effort. Their torch batteries were dying, the beams growing weak and jaundiced, casting long, leaping shadows that seemed to mock their dwindling hope. The constant low groan of moving rock was the soundtrack to their despair, a reminder that the mountain was not done with them yet. The first argument erupted over nothing and everything. It began as a hissed disagreement over which of 2 identical, symbol-strewn corridors to take, a decision that had become a matter of life and death, through sheer repetition. Henri, his nerves frayed to breaking, advocated for the left passage. With a string of profanities, his usual bravado curdled into raw aggression. Claude, his face pale and eyes wide with a terror that had long since eclipsed thought, insisted on the right, his voice rising to a shrill pitch. The debate escalated in seconds. fueled by sleeplessness and the gnawing certainty that every choice was wrong. Accusations flew. Old grievances from the world above were dragged into the oppressive dark. For a moment it seemed they would come to blows, a pathetic, self-destructive scuffle in the belly of a god. Jean's intervention was swift and brutal. He shoved himself between the two men, his own voice a whip-crack of authority that was thin and strained. He forced them apart, his eyes burning with a fury that was mostly directed at himself. This was his failure. He was their leader, the rock upon which their unity was supposed to be built, and he was watching it crumble into dust before his eyes. The doubt that had been a quiet whisper in his own mind now roared. Had he led them to their deaths? Was his steadfastness merely stubbornness, a refusal to admit they were in a fight they could not win? Every command he had given since entering the mountain felt like a step deeper into a trap, and the weight of that responsibility was a physical pressure on his chest. It was in this fractured atmosphere that Henri made his decision. Declaring he could no longer stand the endless circular debates, he announced he would scout ahead alone. He needed to move, to do something, even if it was suicidal. Before Jean could formulate a coherent order to stop him, Henri turned his back on the group, his jaw set in a hard line, and strode into the gloom of the left-hand corridor. His figure was swallowed by the shadows in moments, the sound of his footsteps quickly lost beneath the mountain's eternal groan. His departure was not an act of bravery, but a surrender to the isolation that the labyrinth bred. It left the remaining men in a deeper silence, each one alone with his own terror, the pressure of their impossible situation now magnified by the void where their most defiant comrade had stood. Jean was left grappling with the stark reality of his leadership, a captain on a ship that was sinking not into water, but into madness. The silence that followed Henri's departure was more terrifying than the grinding stone or the whispering dark. It was a waiting silence, a held breath in the throat of the mountain. The remaining men, Jean, Pierre, Claude, and two others, huddled in the weak, dying light of their torches, their ears straining for any sound that was not the labyrinth's mocking rearrangement. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each one measured by the frantic, irregular beat of their own hearts. Jean's face was a granite mask, but his eyes betrayed the churning dread within, the fear that he had just sent a man to his death for the sake of a momentary respite from bickering. The isolation was absolute, a suffocating blanket that smothered the last embers of their camaraderie. When the sound finally came, it was not the confident tread of a returning scout, but a stumbling, scrambling rush. A figure careened around the corner, collapsing into their circle of light. It was Henri, but the man who returned was a ghost of the one who had left. His face was a bloodless white, his eyes wide with a primal horror that had wiped all traces of bravado and aggression from his features. He was trembling violently, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. He clutched at Jean's arm, his grip like a vice, his words tumbling out in a choked, incoherent stream. He babbled about the shadows, not the passive, shifting darkness they had grown accustomed to, but shadows that had moved. He described them as liquid and deliberate, rising from the floor to block his path, forming into tall, slender shapes that reached for him with fingers of solidified night. They made no sound, but their presence was a physical cold that seared the skin. He had fired his rifle, the report a blasphemous noise in the silent corridors, but the bullet had passed, through the form, as if through smoke, and the shadow had only solidified further, its attention now fully, malevolently fixed upon him. His flight had been blind, a panicked sprint through a maze that seemed to open paths only to slam them shut behind him, herding him back to this spot, back to them. Henri's terror was a contagion, spreading through the group in an instant. His account was not the paranoid fantasy of a frightened man. It was the confirmation of their deepest, most unspoken fear. The supernatural was no longer a whispered suggestion or a shifting wall. It was hunting them. The labyrinth was not just a cage, It was a hunting ground, and the shadows were the hounds. Any lingering thought of pushing forward, of finding another way out, evaporated like mist in the dry, heat-blasted air. The concept of escape was a childish fantasy. They were not lost, they were prey. Jean's decision was made without debate, the last grim order of a commander who had run out of options. Their only hope, a frail and desperate one, was to retreat to the one place they knew, the chamber with the black fissure. It was the heart of the horror, but it was a fixed point in the shifting insanity, a known evil in a sea of the unknown. It was an admission of utter defeat, a retreat not to a position of strength, but to the lair of the beast itself. The fear of the inevitable settled over them, a cold, heavy shroud. They were not going to escape the mountain, they were going to die here, and their only remaining choice was where and how. Turning their backs on the labyrinth's endless mocking corridors, they began the hopeless trek back toward the chamber, toward the pulsating dark and the ancient hungry whispers, each step a silent concession to the fate that had been waiting for them all along. The chamber offered no sanctuary, only a stage for the final act of their damnation. The black fissure pulsed with a renewed hungry intensity, its lightless depths seeming to exhale the very substance of the void. The oppressive heat had grown stronger, carrying on its breath the psychic scent of 1 billion years of silence. The whispers were no longer seductive or taunting. They were now a unified, commanding drone, a vibration that resonated in the fillings of their teeth and the marrow of their bones. It was in this crescendo of dread that the shadows, which had until now been fleeting phantoms at the edge of vision, decided to make their introduction permanent. It began with the torchlight. The beams, already weak and guttering, seemed to dim further, as if the darkness itself was drinking the photons. The shadows cast by the men against the symbol-carved walls did not flicker with the movement of the light source. They remained still, then thickened, gaining a depth and solidity that defied physics. Then, one by one, they detached. It was a silent, horrifying mitosis. The silhouette of Claude, cast upon the wall behind him, peeled away from the rock like a layer of black paint, standing for a moment as a two-dimensional cutout before inflating into a three-dimensional form. It was a humanoid shape of pure, lightless black, featureless and silent, its surface seeming to swirl with a slow, internal current. It did not walk, it glided, its movement a seamless, unnerving drift across the stone floor. For a heart-stopping moment, the men could only stare, their minds refusing to process the tangible impossibility before them. The paralysis broke when the shadow that had been Claude's mimic lunged. It moved with impossible speed, a blur of solidified night. It did not strike with a fist or a weapon, but simply passed through the leg of the nearest fighter, a man named Luke. There was no sound of impact, only a choked gasp from Luke as he collapsed. Where the shadow had touched him, his trousers and the flesh beneath were not cut or bruised, but simply gone. A perfect, smooth, bloodless void existed where his calf muscle had been, the edges of the wound seared black and cold, as if flash-frozen, and then erased. Luke screamed, a raw, animal sound of agony and disbelief, clutching at the horrifying absence on his leg. The supernatural had not just become tangible, it had become a predator, with a taste for reality itself. The chamber erupted into chaos. Jean's order to open fire was a ragged shout, swallowed by the roar of their own weapons. Muzzle flashes strobed against the darkness, illuminating the nightmare in frantic, frozen tableaus. Bullets passed through the shadow forms without resistance, punching harmless holes in the chamber wall behind them. The shadows seemed to absorb the light and sound, their advance unhurried, unstoppable. They were relentless, their silence more terrifying than any battle cry. They moved through the men's defensive positions, their touch erasing fabric, skin, and hope with equal indifference. The air grew thick with the smell of cordite and the ozone stench of violated physics, a futile human struggle against a force that operated on laws they could not comprehend. With every passing second, with every scream of pain and every uselessly spent round, their hope dwindled, replaced by the cold, certain knowledge that they were not fighting an enemy, but an extinction. The shadows were not deterred by the storm of lead, they were fed by it. Each muzzle flash seemed to give them greater substance, each panicked shout a richer darkness to draw upon. They moved with a chilling fluid grace, weaving through the frantic defensive fire as if the bullets were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Their true weapon was the terror they inspired, a palpable force that sapped the will as effectively as their touch erased flesh. A fighter would empty his clip into an approaching form, watching the rounds vanish into its swirling black depths, only to have the shadow glide through him a moment later. He would stumble back, a section of his shoulder or arm now a smooth, impossible void, his scream cut short by the shock of his own. Dissolution. The chamber floor became a grotesque map of their retreat, littered not with bodies, but with parts of bodies, cleanly and surgically removed from existence. Pierre, pressed against the cold carved wall, watched the carnage not with the blind panic of the others, but with the horrified clarity of a man who has read the final chapter of a terrible book. His eyes, wide and red-rimmed, were fixed on the pulsating fissure. He saw the connection now, the awful, elegant symmetry of it. He shouted to Jean, his voice cracking under the strain, the words a desperate attempt to impart a final, crucial understanding before it was too late. The shadows were not independent entities, he cried. They were manifestations, extensions of the fissure itself. They were its will-given form, its hunger made tangible, psychic tendrils reaching out from the portal to feed on the fear and despair of its prey. They were not beings to be fought, but symptoms of the disease. The real enemy was the gate, the ancient hungry mouth at the center of the mountain, and the shadows were merely its teeth. Jean heard Pierre's revelation through a haze of adrenaline and dread. The intellectual's theory, delivered in a shriek of terror, crystallized the hopelessness of their situation. They were not in a battle, they were being consumed. His command to form a defensive ring, to make a stand, now felt like the empty formal ritual of a man ordering the tide to retreat. But it was all he had left. He bellowed the order, his voice raw, and the remaining men, those who could still stand and hold a weapon, fell back, creating a tight circle with their backs to the fissure, a final pathetic defiance against the closing dark. They were a ring of humanity facing outwards, their weapons aimed at the gliding, silent shapes that converged on them from all sides. A last stand against an unknown that had already won. The battle was no longer for escape or victory, but for the manner of their ending, a final, fleeting assertion of their will against the inexorable pull of the void. The silence that fell was more terrible than the gunfire. The shadows, having tasted their fill of fear and flesh, retreated not in defeat, but in satiation, melting back into the walls and floor until only the memory of their touch remained, a phantom cold in the air. The chamber was a charnel house of absences, the wounded moaning softly as they clutched at voids where limbs had been, their injuries defying all field medicine and logic. It was in this fragile, shattered quiet that Claude began to laugh. The sound was wrong from the first note, a low guttural rasp that scraped against the stones, a noise that held no humor, only a bottomless ancient malice. All eyes turned to him. He stood near the fissure, his body rigid, his head tilted at an unnatural angle as if listening to a voice only he could hear. His own voice, when it came, was a ruin. The familiar tones of the young, terrified fighter were gone, stripped away and replaced by something that sounded like grinding stones and shifting continents. The words were French, but the cadence was alien, the pronunciation distorted as if spoken by a throat not meant for human language. He spoke of epochs, of watching civilizations rise from the mud and crumble to dust. He named himself as a dweller in the deep places, a shard of consciousness from a time before light, a passenger who had found a new vessel. The entity wearing Claude's skin flexed his fingers, studying them with a detached, clinical curiosity, as if operating a complex and unfamiliar puppet. The loss of identity was absolute and horrifyingly visible. Claude was no longer present behind his own eyes. Then, the thing that had been Claude moved. It was not the panicked lunge of a cornered man, but the efficient, predatory strike of a hunter. It turned on the man closest to it, Luke, who was still whimpering on the floor, holding the void where his leg had been. With a speed that was blinding, it was upon him, its hands, Claude's hands, clamping around Luke's throat. But it was not trying to strangle him. The entity held him down, its face inches from Luke's, and a new sound emerged, a sibilant chanting whisper that seemed to suck the warmth from the very air. Luke's eyes, wide with terror, began to film over with the same milky, ancient blankness. Jean and Henri reacted in a surge of adrenaline-fueled horror. They threw themselves at the possessed man, grabbing his arms, trying to pry him away from his victim. The strength they encountered was immense, inhuman. It was like trying to bend iron. The entity barely seemed to notice their efforts, its chant continuing unabated. It took all their combined weight and desperation to finally wrestle it back, pinning it against the rough-hewn wall. They used belts and torn strips of cloth to bind Claude's thrashing limbs, the thing inside him fighting with a feral, relentless power, its guttural voice cursing them in dead languages. As they tightened the final knot, a wave of pure icy paranoia washed over the chamber. Every man now looked at his comrade not as a brother in arms, but as a potential shell, a hollow man waiting to be filled by the ancient hungry presence that had taken Claude. The enemy was no longer outside them, it was looking for a way in, and it had just proved it could wear their faces. The fragile restraint holding the thing that had been Claude was a mockery of safety. The belts and cloth straps bit deep into his thrashing limbs, but the power coursing through him was not of muscle and sinew, it was a force of the mountain itself, a tectonic pressure building behind human skin. His guttural curses shifted from dead languages to a chorus of overlapping voices, a cacophony of different timbres and ages that tumbled from his mouth in a single, horrifying stream. It was the sound of a crowded, ancient tomb-given voice, a parliament of ghosts arguing through one ruined throat. The other men backed away, their weapons wavering, unsure whether to aim at their bound comrade or at each other. The paranoia was a living thing now, coiling through the chamber, its venom in every shared fearful glance. Then, the infection spread. Another fighter, a quiet man named Mathis who had been crouched in a shadowed alcove, suddenly stood bolt upright. His head snapped back, his mouth unhinging in a silent scream before a new voice, sharp and sibilant, hissed from his lips. He spoke of stars that were cold and dead, of geometries that could unmake a mind. His hands, once calloused and familiar, now carved intricate, impossible patterns in the air, leaving faint, shimmering trails of darkness that hung for a moment before dissipating. He was not fighting the possession, he was embracing it, a terrifying ecstasy lighting his features. Across the chamber, a third man began to speak in a low, rhythmic chant, his eyes rolled back in his head, his body swaying to a beat only he could hear. The overlapping voices created a dissonant hymn to the fissure, a symphony of surrender that drowned out the whimpers of the still sane. Jean's control, that steadfast rock upon which the unit had been built, shattered into dust. His commands were swallowed by the psychic din, his presence ignored. He was no longer a leader of men, but a spectator to a mass conversion. He watched, his heart a cold stone in his chest, as Pierre slowly rose from where he had been huddled. The scholar's face was not twisted in terror or resistance, but was instead a mask of rapturous awe. He walked toward the pulsating fissure as if in a dream, his hands outstretched. The whispers were not assaulting him, they were coursing through him, a river of forbidden knowledge he had spent his life craving. He did not look back at Jean, his entire being focused on the black beating heart of the mountain. The seduction of power was complete in him, the promise of understanding the cosmos's darkest secrets was a prize far greater than survival, and he paid for it with the last shreds of his humanity, walking willingly into the thrall of the ancient dark. The thin, frayed cord of camaraderie, stretched to its breaking point by shifting stone and whispering shadows, finally snapped under the weight of a single damning accusation. It came from Henri, his face a contorted mask of rage and fear, his finger stabbing through the oppressive air toward Pierre. The scholar stood near the pulsating fissure, his posture one of strange reverence, his eyes still glazed with the rapturous awe that had drawn him toward the ancient dark. Henri's voice was a raw, broken thing, stripped of all its former bravado and sharpened into a weapon of pure blame. He did not shout about the moving walls or the shadow creatures. He fixed upon the one thing he could almost understand, Pierre's fascination, his whispered theories, his claim to comprehend the symbols. In Henri's terror-scoured mind, correlation became causation. Pierre's curiosity had not merely observed their doom, it had invited it. The accusation landed like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. The other men, their nerves flayed raw by possession and impossible injury, latched onto the simple human explanation with the desperation of drowning men. It was easier to blame a man than a mountain, to hate a traitor than to fear a god. Their eyes, once filled with brotherly trust, now burned with a collective suspicious fury. They turned on Pierre, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus of agreement, each man adding his own layer to the indictment. He had led them astray with his theories. He had been whispering to the walls. He was in league with the thing in the fissure. The betrayal was not in anything Pierre had done, but in what he represented, the intellectual arrogance that had, in their shattered minds, pried open a door that should have remained forever sealed. Pierre recoiled, the ecstatic light in his eyes dimming, replaced by a dawning horror of a different kind. He tried to speak, to explain that his understanding was a curse, not a conspiracy, but his words were swallowed by the rising tide of their fury. He was a scholar, a man of reason, and he was facing the unreasoning terror of the pack. He backed away, his hands raised in a futile gesture of placation, stumbling toward the chamber wall with its silent, judging symbols. The violence erupted not as a calculated attack, but as a spontaneous explosion of pent-up fear. Claude, the quiet one, whose mind had been most deeply scarred by the sight of his possessed namesake, was the first to break. With a wordless cry of anguish, he lunged at Pierre, not with a weapon, but with his bare hands, driven by a need to destroy the source of his terror. He slammed into the scholar, sending them both crashing against the carved stone. The sound of the impact was sickeningly solid, a brutal counterpoint to the whispers and the groaning rock. They fell to the floor in a tangle of limbs, a chaotic scuffle of grunts and tearing fabric. It was over in seconds, but the damage was irrevocable. Jean and Henri pulled them apart, but not before Claude's head struck a jagged outcrop of rock with a wet, final crack. He went limp instantly, a dark spreading stain blooming beneath his hair. The fight drained from the chamber as quickly as it had ignited, leaving behind a ringing silence broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Claude lay motionless, his sightless eyes staring at the cavern ceiling, a victim not of shadows or possession, but of the trust that had shattered among them. The men stared at his body, then at each other, the last vestiges of their unit cohesion dissolving into the chilling air. They were no longer a team, no longer brothers. They were a collection of isolated, terrified individuals, and the true horror of the mountain was that it had made them its accomplices. The corpse of Claude was more than a body, it was a monument to their shattered unity, a cold, accusing weight in the chamber's oppressive heat. The violent outburst had drained the men of their collective fury, leaving behind a hollowed-out silence thick with shame and a deeper, more personal terror. They stood in isolated clusters, no longer a unit but a scattering of individuals, each man retreating into the fortress of his own fear. The bonds forged in the French cellars and tested on the alpine slopes had not been broken by the shifting labyrinth or the shadow creatures, but by their own hands, in a single stupid, human moment. The fragility of those bonds was now laid bare, as delicate as glass and just as shattered. From this fracture, two opposing camps emerged with a stark, desperate clarity. One group, led by Henri, gravitated toward the chamber's entrance, or where the entrance had once been. Theirs was the philosophy of the cornered animal. They advocated for resistance, for a final furious assault on the living rock, for dying on their feet with weapons in hand, even if their bullets were useless. It was a clean soldier's end, a concept they could wrap their minds around. The other faction, smaller and more broken, found themselves drawn toward the pulsating fissure. Their will had been utterly extinguished. They saw the endless, hopeless struggle of the labyrinth and the relentless hunger of the shadows, and they chose surrender. The whispers from the void now promised not power, but an end to the fear, the exhaustion, the cold, and the terrible gnawing certainty of their fate. To them, oblivion was a kinder master than the mountain. Jean stood between them, a leader without an army. He moved from one group to the other, his voice low and urgent, stripped of its former command and now raw with a desperate plea. He spoke of their shared oath, of the lives they had lived before the mountain, of the world that still existed somewhere beyond the stone. He appealed to the memory of their brotherhood, to the jokes shared in the snow and the silent watches kept in the dark. He tried to weave the frayed threads of their loyalty back together, his words a final, fragile attempt to build a dam against the tide of despair. But his plea for unity fell on deaf ears, its echo swallowed by the hungry silence of the fissure and the grim resolve of the resistors. The men looked at him, and they saw not their captain, but another lost soul, his authority rendered meaningless by the scale of the horror around them. The trust he asked for was a currency they no longer possessed. Henri would not look at him, his jaw set, his entire being focused on the futile defiance of the stone. The men near the fissure seemed to look through him, their eyes already fixed on the dark promise of the void. Jean's words dissolved into the thick, heated air, accomplishing nothing. The schism was complete. The last thin veneer of civilization had peeled away, leaving only the base instincts of fight or flight, of resistance or surrender, played out in the antechamber of an ancient, hungry god. They were no longer a team betrayed by one man, but a collection of souls, each alone, preparing to meet their end in their own way, the fragile architecture of human connection crumbling into dust around them. The fissure was no longer a tear in the world, but a beating heart of pure temptation. Its lightless maw pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, each throb sending a wave of dry psychic heat washing over the shattered remnants of the unit. The whispers that coiled from its depths had shed their taunting, alien quality. Now they were intimate, personal, a silken voice tailored to the secret desires of each man's soul. To the exhausted it promised rest, a final, dreamless sleep free from fear and cold. To the hopeless, it offered an end to the struggle, a graceful surrender to the inevitable. And to the curious, the broken like Pierre, it whispered of revelations, of truths that would make the sacrifice of a mere mortal life a trifling price for cosmic understanding. It was a siren song that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the weary spirit, its pull a physical force, a gentle, insistent tugging at their very core. Reason, that fragile scaffold of human consciousness, began to buckle under the strain. The arguments, the terror, the sheer impossibility of their situation had scraped their minds raw, leaving them vulnerable to the fisher's seductive call. The memory of Claude's death, of the shadow touch that erased flesh, of the labyrinth's mocking geometry, all of it coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. Resistance was a futile, painful prolonging of the agony. The fisher offered a shortcut through the pain, a finality that was, in its own horrifying way, a form of mercy. The temptation to simply stop fighting, to let go of the crushing weight of survival, became an overwhelming logical conclusion. They began to move, not as a group, but as solitary pilgrims drawn to a dark altar. Their movements were slow, dreamlike, their eyes fixed on the pulsating dark. One of the younger fighters, his face slack with a profound exhaustion, was the first. He took a step, then another, his rifle clattering to the stone floor, a sound that went entirely unnoticed. He walked toward the fisher not with the panic of a man fleeing a threat, but with the serene acceptance of a devotee approaching a shrine. Another followed, then a third, their bodies moving with a will that was no longer entirely their own. They were not being dragged, they were being welcomed. The whispers wove a cocoon of false peace around them, muting the shouts of those who remained, making the descent seem not like a fall but like a homecoming. Tension, fear, and reason were all overridden by the simple primal urge to answer the call, to step into the quiet dark and be done with the screaming light of the world. The fissure did not simply wait, it reached, the gentle, hypnotic pulse quickened into a frantic, hungry rhythm, and the lightless black at its center began to churn like a whirlpool of tar. The dry heat intensified, now a physical wind that tore at their clothes and hair, pulling them forward. The whispers became a roar, a chaotic symphony of promises and threats that filled their skulls, drowning out all other thought. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming a viscous current flowing inexorably toward the void. The first to cross the threshold was not one of the broken, willing converts, but a resistor who had stood with Henri. He had been backing away, raising his weapon in a final defiant gesture, when the pull seized him. His boots scrabbled for purchase on the smooth stone, but it was like trying to stand against a tidal wave. With a cry that was swallowed by the psychic din, he was yanked from his feet and dragged into the swirling dark, his form dissolving into the blackness without a trace. Then it was Pierre's turn. He did not fight it. He stood at the very edge, his arms slightly spread, his face uplifted in an expression of rapturous, terrifying acceptance. The scholar who had sought answers had found the ultimate one, and it had cost him everything. He turned his head, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met Jean's across the chamber. There was no fear in that look, no plea for help, only a profound alien clarity, a final silent signal that the point of no return had not just been reached, but had been irrevocably crossed. Then he stepped forward, not fell but stepped, as if onto solid ground. The blackness enveloped him instantly, swallowing his form whole. His disappearance was not violent, but it was absolute, a chillingly peaceful erasure that was more terrifying than any scream. Jean alone fought back with every shred of his being. He dug his heels into the stone, muscles screaming in protest, his body leaning backward at a desperate angle against the impossible force. He was an anchor in a hurricane. The only thing tethering him to a world that was rapidly ceasing to exist. He saw his men, his brothers, one by one succumb. Some were ripped from their feet, cartwheeling into the abyss. Others, their minds broken, simply walked into the dark with blank, serene smiles. Henri was the last of the resistors, his furious curses lost in the roar as he was plucked from the ground and vanished. Jean's own name was a whisper in the maelstrom, a personal, intimate call from the void, promising an end to the weight of command, to the guilt, to the endless, crushing responsibility. It was the most potent temptation of all. But he resisted. his jaw clenched so tight he felt his teeth might shatter, his fingers bleeding where they clawed at the rock floor. He was the last point of light, and he would not let it be extinguished without a fight, even as the irrevocable choice of every other soul echoed in the consuming dark around him. The fissure did not simply exist, it lived. In the wake of the last soul's absorption, its gentle, hypnotic pulse exploded into a violent, seismic thrumming that shook the very foundations of the mountain. The lightless black was gone, replaced by a core of incandescent, sickly green light that beat like a diseased heart, casting the chamber in throbbing, nauseating waves of illumination. The heat was no longer a dry warmth, but a furnace blast, searing the lungs and blistering exposed skin. The whispers coalesced into a single, deafening roar, a psychic tsunami that battered the last vestiges of individual thought from the remaining fighters. They were no longer men making choices, but leaves caught in a hurricane, their identities, their memories, their very selves unraveling in the chaotic energy and being drawn into the ravenous, glowing core. Gene, his body screaming in protest, watched the final dissolution. A man named Luke, who had once spoken wistfully of his family's vineyard, now stood slack-jawed, his eyes vacant pools reflecting the pulsating green. As the light flared, his form seemed to become translucent, then insubstantial, his outline blurring like a photograph left in the rain. With the next thunderous pulse, he simply streamed away, a wisp of smoke drawn into the fissure's maw. Another fighter, Michel, clawed at his own face, as if trying to peel off a mask, his mouth open in a silent scream as his body dissolved into a shower of shimmering motes that were eagerly consumed by the light. They were not being killed, they were being unmade, their essence siphoned away to feed the ancient, starving intelligence at the mountain's heart. They were losing themselves not to death, but to assimilation. And in that maelstrom of light and sound, amidst the horrifying spectacle of his men's erasure, a moment of terrible crystalline clarity pierced Gene's consciousness. It was not a thought but a knowing, a revelation etched into his soul by the very nature of the horror before him. This was no gate, no portal to another world. It was a predator, a demonic entity of pure cosmic hunger that had slumbered in the stone for eons, its consciousness a void that sought only to be filled. The symbols were not a language, but a cage, and the Nazis, in their arrogant folly, had not been researchers. They had been jailers who had tampered with the locks. The whispers were not promises, but bait. The shadows were not its minions, but its feelers. The possession was not an invasion, but a consumption. Every terror, every twist of reality, every shred of despair had been carefully orchestrated to soften them up, to break their will and make their souls palatable. The final revelation was the understanding of the hunter, and the chilling certainty that they had never been anything but prey. Gene stood alone in the roaring heart of the mountain, the last sentinel before the devouring light. The furnace blast of heat and the deafening psychic roar were a physical wall, yet within him a deeper, colder silence had fallen. The frantic struggle for survival was over, replaced by the stark geometry of a final decision. He could fight, a single futile gesture of defiance against the cosmic hunger that had consumed his men. He could empty his pistol into the pulsating green abyss, scream his rage until his voice was raw, and die as a soldier, his defiance a brief, bright spark in the endless dark. Or he could accept the fate that had claimed the others, to step forward and let the oblivion take him, to surrender to the promise of an end to the pain, the guilt, the crushing weight of being the last one standing. The choice was a chasm wider than the fissure itself, and he stood on its edge, his eyes, gritty with dust and exhaustion, swept across the chamber, a tombstone for his command. He saw the ghost of Henri's defiant posture near the sealed entrance, the memory of Pierre's rapturous surrender at the fissure's edge. He saw the empty spaces where men had laughed, argued, and trusted one another with their lives. the duty that had defined him, the steadfast leadership that had been his core, now presented him with its ultimate cruelest expression. He could not save them, he could not lead them out, but he could choose how he remained with them. To fight was to die for himself, for his own pride. To accept was to die for the memory of them, to bear witness to their end without turning his face away. His choice was not between life and death, but between the manner of his sacrifice. He let his rifle fall. The clatter of metal on stone was a tiny, insignificant sound, swallowed instantly by the fisher's roar. He would not give the entity the satisfaction of his struggle. He would not fuel its feast with his fear. Instead, he took a step forward, then another, not with the dreamlike trance of the others, but with a deliberate, solemn resolve. He was not walking toward the light. He was placing himself between it and the ghosts of his men, a final, symbolic act of protection. He would stand guard over their memory until the very end. He braced himself, feet planted wide, a rock against the torrent, his gaze fixed on the searing green heart of the demonic entity, refusing to look away. The fisher responded to his defiance not with anger, but with a renewed, focused hunger. The light pulsed, and a tendril of solidified emerald energy lashed out from the core, not toward Jean but toward the far wall where the ghost of Claude's final violent moment lingered. The air around that spot shimmered, and a phantom image of the young fighter seemed to coalesce for a heart-stopping second, his face a mask of confused terror, before the green energy wrapped around it and pulled, drawing the last echo of his consciousness into the maw. John watched, his heart a stone in his chest, as the memory was erased from reality itself. Another pulse, and the echo of Mathis's possessed chanting was siphoned from the air. One by one, the psychic remnants of his men were taken, their final moments, their fears, their very presence in the chamber, systematically consumed. Jean could only stand and watch, his sacrifice rendered a hollow, pathetic gesture. He had chosen to protect them, but the entity was proving it could take them anyway, devouring not just their bodies, but the very shadows they had left on the world. The futility of his choice was absolute, a lesson in powerlessness taught by a god that fed on time and memory, leaving him alone in the roaring light, with nothing but the certainty of his own imminent meaningless end. The final pulse was not a sound, but a cessation, a great silent inhalation from the heart of the world that pulled the last vestige of Jean's being into the void. There was no pain, no final moment of terror, only a sudden, absolute unraveling. His memories, of his daughter's laugh, the scent of French soil, the weight of command, streamed away like smoke, his consciousness dissolving into the ancient, collective hunger of the fisher. His body, the last physical testament to the unit's existence, did not fall. It disintegrated into a fine, shimmering dust that was eagerly drawn into the pulsating green core. With his absorption, the light in the chamber flared one last time, a triumphant, deafening silent roar, and then, with a sigh of settling stone, it collapsed in on itself. The fissure sealed, leaving behind only unbroken, cool granite, its surface as smooth and featureless as if it had been polished for 1,000,000 years. The heat vanished, the whispers fell silent, and the mountain's heart returned to its slumber, sated and secret once more. The chamber was empty, its silence deeper than any mere absence of sound, a perfect, pristine void where a dozen men had ceased to be. Weeks later, a team of Allied scouts, guided by the last fragmented radio transmission from Jean's unit, found the coordinates. They discovered no hidden entrance, no camouflage door. Instead, they found a massive, recent cave-in, a chaotic tumble of boulders and shattered granite that sealed the mountainside completely. It was a collapse of such immense natural scale that it appeared to have been triggered by an avalanche or a minor earthquake, a common enough occurrence in the volatile Alps. They scanned the area for days, using picks and probes, but found no gaps, no hollow spaces behind the rockfall, no trace of a man-made tunnel. There was no discarded equipment, no scraps of cloth, no shell casings, not even a footprint in the scree that could not be explained by their own presence. It was as if the mountain had simply swallowed the unit whole and then healed its own wound with indifferent geological finality. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead, their fate attributed to the treacherous and unpredictable nature of the high mountains. But in the hushed, smoke-filled rooms of Allied intelligence, and in the taverns where soldiers gathered to share stories the brass would never hear, a different narrative took root. Whispers began to circulate, fueled by the utter lack of evidence and the strange details of the original mission brief. They spoke of otherworldly abduction, of a Nazi obsession with forces that should have been left alone, of a unit that had not been lost to rock and ice, but to something far older and more terrifying. The story of Gene and his men became a ghost story, a cautionary tale about prying into the dark places of the world. They were not remembered as war heroes, but as phantoms, their vanishing and enduring mystery that served as a stark reminder of the vast, unknown shadows that lay just beyond the edge of human understanding, waiting in the silent, patient stone.